Welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss An Unlikely Spy and everything else you're up to.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Um, Listeners, it is 6 in the morning in Australia where Rebecca is. So we're having like an in the dark podcast situation here, which is great. It adds an extra layer of intimacy to this conversation. So love it.
It does. It adds to the mystique, doesn't it?
Yes,
The
exactly.
sense of disguise.
Yes, already on edge with the mystery behind your book and everything. Can you tell listeners what your book is about, and also what made you choose the first quote, the epitaph or epithet or whatever you want to call it, that discusses
Mhm.
how to know whether or not you're a monster or if this is just what humans really are?
Yeah, well, okay. So, An Unlikely Spy is set in London. Well, set in two time frames, both in London. Most of the book is set in 1939, and it covers the first year of the Second World War, the quiet period, I suppose you'd describe it, at least for the British. During which time Evelyn, a young 21-year-old, is recruited to work for MI5, the intelligence agency based in London. And her work really involves the infiltration of a far-right Hitler sympathiser group who were made up of very influential establishment figures in the UK, and this is based on real events and real people. And the novel explores, it explores her work as a spy, the kind of the technical aspects of it, the processes for her training, and how she will go about infiltrating this group. But it also explores the kind of psychological impacts of this work has on her, how it is she has really come to be in this, what I found anyway, quite extraordinary position of, both this high stakes intelligence work at a really young age, but also how it was that she was kind of primed for this work, what made her really a suitable candidate for adopting, a different persona, and how she reflects on those processes and what it does to her sense of herself, but also her relationships with other people. And some of those people are actually very, very close to her and have actually helped her in the progression of her career. So that sort of personal and professional worlds really collide later in the story. But the epigraph from Clarice Lispector, um, the quote is, "Who has not asked himself at some time or other, am I a monster, or is this what it means to be a person?" I suppose really jumped out to me. I like Lispector, but also the whole book sort of explores what betrayal means, and also what, for Evelyn, her work as a spy requires her to adopt the persona of these other far right, individuals, many of whom have really sort of abhorrent, awful views, as we know now historically, very anti-Semitic, in particular, very much in favour of an allegiance or an alliance with Hitler, and also, a range of other kind of really problematic views as we look back on them historically. And so that was what I wanted to explore. Can Evelyn still feel that sense of betrayal for people, who are, kind of objectively awful kind of people, but she has to develop an intimacy and a friendship with them as well. So it's all around that kind of complexity, that I wanted to explore in the book.
And what piqued your interest about this to begin with? So your last book was about bullying and boarding
Yeah.
school, and now we're like deep in the like James Bond as a woman type of, World War II. How did you get there? Like what piqued your interest about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've been asked that a lot, and people sort of asking if there are threads between the earlier books. I mean, I was really just interested in, that kind of fundamental question of, where do we find belonging? And, so often we can find belonging in the wrong places. And my first book explored how that happened to me as a teenager. Obviously, this is fictional. It's set, in the 1930s in London. So all of those sorts of differences. But it's really a character study of this young woman and how it is her life is so transformed by some particular sort of circumstances around her own upbringing, her educational opportunities, and really she really shouldn't have been in that position at all, because she was plucked kind of from obscurity when she wins a scholarship. Evelyn, this is, to go on to a prestigious boarding school. That's where she meets these people who become her friends, who have influence later in the story. But I mean, I'm interested in World War II in London. I love London as a city. I've spent a lot of time there. And I was interested in that particular period of the war. I think we read a lot about, like you said, the sort of the James Bond, the action-packed, the kind of military operational aspects of the war. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the psychological aspect of it. I didn't know a lot about the first year of the war, the so-called phony war, where nothing was happening and there was still the belief that war wasn't, that it would be over. It was really interesting to read back over so much archival material in the intelligence service. There was this conflict between what the intelligence service were telling government, because the government of the time in the UK really didn't want to go to war. They really wanted, it's understandable, obviously, but there was this real reluctance, whereas MI5, where Evelyn was working at the time, they were really warning them of many threats. But the biggest concern was this uprising of pro-German British nationals, who, in the event of invasion during that first year of the war, there was a real fear that Hitler was going to be crossing the Channel. And if in the event of that happening, the intelligence agencies were really paranoid about these establishment figures rising up and helping with that insurrection and with that invasion too. So much of their work was focused on local people and the threats they posed as well. And to me, that was just absolutely fascinating, because there are so many contemporary parallels between that. And I started writing the book in 2016, which was such a huge year for everyone, particularly for you guys over in the States. But also in the UK, Brexit was happening, nationalism was on the rise, Australia has its own complicated sort of political situation too. So there was a lot swirling around. So that to me was really fascinating, looking at that through the lens of this particular historical event and these characters, and drawing out those parallels, I suppose.
Did you major in history? Have you always been into history, or?
No, I haven't had any kind of formal training in history. I read a lot of historical novels, and it's just, again, I suppose I didn't maybe set out to write a book like this. It was something that kind of held my interest, and I wanted to know whether it would be possible to write a historical novel. So that's. Yeah, that's
it's an accidental historical novel,
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Wow, that's funny. I mean, it's impressive. It's not really funny. I mean, it's just like it's impressive, because
I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like I just sort of whipped it up, because like I say, it was 4 years of, and I mean, the thing about historical fiction, obviously, is there's so much research. And that was one of the really wonderful things about it too, going and doing that research. Being in these particular places, spending time there, but also I went and visited the National Archives in London, in Kew, which was absolutely fascinating, because one of the things that happened during that early period of my research is they declassified, the government declassified a whole bunch of cables and archival material, these transcripts of interviews that MI5 did during this period, which kind of illuminated a lot of what was going on behind the scenes. But it gave me this sense that sort of almost the personality of the people involved, though they're pretty sort of standard, but the kind of language that was used, the attitudes, it was all, I mean, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. It was a kind of nerd's paradise in the archives. But that worked its way into the book too. So that was really fantastic.
And then let me ask you a really stupid question. So is The Imitator the UK version of the same book, or is that a totally different book?
No, that's the Australian edition. So
Okay.
that's called that. The name of the same book
I
over
thought
here
so.
is The Imitator. Yes, I know it's a little bit confusing, but hopefully,
No,
hopefully
I
it's
just
not
wanted
too
to
big
make
a.
sure. I was like, did she couldn't have done like a whole second book in this
No.
same genre in the same time period. But okay. Um, wow. So tell me about like the rest, like, okay, you've started all of this research, you've done these books, and you also have started Kill Your Darlings, which are you, it sounds, looks like from the masthead you're still involved in and everything. Tell me about starting that. Tell me about how you balance your time with all of that and all of the writing and just like what your life is like now.
Yeah, okay. Oh. So yeah, I do. I run Kill Your Darlings, which is a magazine. We're online now over here in Australia, though you can read it anywhere in the world. And so this is a magazine. It's a literary magazine, but we also, a lot of my time spent facilitating some other activities that we do. We run writers' workshops, mentor programs, manuscript assessments, because I'm also, you know, my day job is as an editor. I was working in-house for various publishers over here in Australia, but I went freelance about 5 years ago. So I still do editing work as well on a freelance basis. So my editing and Kill Your Darlings work's about part-time or so, maybe, you know, across the week, 2.5 to 3 days, and then I spend the rest of the time sort of writing. So yeah, I filled in, you know, fill in writing around other work, that sort of balance, I suppose. But I do try to write every day. So usually in the mornings. I also have a 2-year-old, so that's
Aw.
yeah. So I'm hoping he's going to stay asleep throughout our chat, but we will see. And so that's obviously, you know, as I'm sure you and many of your listeners know, that's a whole other element to be balancing with work. And I mean, working from home, and obviously with everything been going on with COVID, that's been challenging, as it's been challenging for everyone. Life in Australia has been a lot easier for, you know, almost everyone else in the entire world. So we've been really fortunate. So yeah, so everyone's been juggling work and life and working from home as well. It's just that whole. But I mean, I wrote the book. I was still editing. The book was accepted by my Australian publisher. I was about 2 weeks away from gonna have him, and then I was doing editing. The bulk of the editing was, and working with my American publisher was when he was about 9 months old or something. So I can't believe, looking back on that time, I can't believe I even did that. But sometimes that narrow focus and that task at hand. Someone said to me once that, if you're working and you're a parent, your levels of efficiency just are kind of off the charts because you have such a limited amount of time and so much to do. And I found that that's the case. I procrastinate much less now, so
Yes.
that's good.
I know people always ask me that, and I'm like, well, I just like have to do it. Like I have, this is my time. I focus on one thing at a time, and I'm like, okay, now I'm doing this. Now I'm doing that.
That's
Now I'm
right.
like doing like 20
That's right.
minutes of like kids' medical forms, and now I'm gonna hang out with them, and I have 4 kids, so anyway, I get
That's
it.
right. Yeah.
Um,
Oh my
but
God. Okay. Wow. Yeah.
But I have to say, my kids are a little older. I have a 6 and 7-year-old, and then twins who are almost 14. And in the pandemic, I was like, at least they're older. I mean, having a baby, I mean, that is, I think having one child that age is harder than 4 kids who are older. Just FYI, I think.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, presumably you had to homeschool the kids as well and do all.
Yeah,
Oh my, I don't know how
that
that.
was not
Yeah.
fun.
So
That was
anyway,
not
it's
fun.
just.
So I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah,
It's,
absolutely. But no, so that's how the day, yeah, that day sort of spent. And I mean, it's not. I feel lucky that my day job as it was is also working with words and always engaging with writing and having conversations with writers, because that's really enriching when it comes to my own work. And being an editor has been so transformative for my own writing process, and also when it comes to reworking my own material too. So that's been great.
So did I make up that you're getting a PhD? Was that you? Did I make that up?
Yeah, I was also doing a I
Okay,
was
I'm like,
also
because
doing a
I'm literally like
PhD.
doubting myself. I'm like, that can't be her then.
No, yes, I thought it'd be a good idea to also do to do a PhD. So I started that. I started that about 4 years ago as well. I have actually finished that, so I'm almost. I've gotten the examiner's reports back, so I just need to make a couple of changes. So in a couple of months, that will be done, and then I'll hopefully be. That's when I'll be awarded my doctorate. So
Wow.
that was that was probably the taking on too much. There was a point last year when I was going, oh my god, why have I done this? But I had managed to juggle it until that point. It's just when the submission, the mad scramble to get it in, because I'd maxed out. I'm not sure what it's like in the States, but in Australia now with your PhD, you used to be able to kind of take as really kind of as long as you wanted. But they've cracked down here, and if you go over your 4 years, you've got to start paying fees and all this sort of thing. So I said to
Oh.
myself, right, I've got to do this, and then it was just absolutely crazy. So that was good to be done. But I've learnt my lesson about. I've finally realised I have to scale back, not scale up now.
Oh my gosh. And I think that so one of your last projects is being adapted or was optioned or something. And what about this project? What's going on with that?
Well, it's so far it's all quiet on that front. So I mean, it'd be obviously wonderful if the book was to take on another form. So obviously, yeah, if anyone is interested, that's it's wonderful. So I mean, I think there's an appetite for this kind of material as well. So yeah, that'd be great if that was to happen.
Is there anything you learned about that time period, not to distill your entire, magnum opus of research down to one or two sound bites, but um, is there something about that time that you learned that you were really surprised about, or just that isn't like mainstream knowledge, or aside from the quiet period in general and,
Yeah.
the overall sentiment of the time? Anything?
Yeah, I think there were two. I think there were two things, which are sort of quite different, but they're sort of more social. I mean, maybe I did know these things, but they were definitely sort of clarified, and through the process of research and writing. So the first was that, well, I mean, I really came to the real seed of the idea, that very first little sort of idea in the back of my head was I came across this article in a British newspaper, and it was an obituary for a woman who she died when she was in her sort of late 80s, and it was only sort of right before her death that she'd revealed to her family. So she'd lived a pretty kind of conventional, ordinary, in inverted commas, life, and she revealed, very close to her death, to her family, that she'd actually worked for MI5 and she'd been involved in parachuting into France, during the occupation, and, really just extraordinary stuff. So she'd had this career during the war. Then the war ended and her service was sort of terminated, and she was required to go back to her life as it had been before, which was living in, the countryside, getting married, having children, never working again. And I just could not believe this. I mean, as a contemporary, 21st century woman, this made my blood boil. It made my blood boil that these were the circumstances in which women's working lives were kind of, dictated, but that she'd been erased from history, and there was this tiny little sort of note in the newspaper about her achievements. So that was a big propellant for me to uncover this story. I mean, Evelyn is not that kind of character. She's not kind of overtly heroic. I think she's a courageous person in many ways, but she's much more complex in terms of creating this character on the page. but I wanted to uncover those kinds of stories. So, and I mean, I just came across countless stories of women whose service was obviously so important and so integral, but so often it's forgotten. You know, if we think about these war stories, or even if we think about espionage stories, you know, it's such a masculine space. So that for me was really important. And obviously I was aware of women, you know, having these working opportunities during the war and then going back to the, you know, sort of the housewife sort of role, such as it was back then, very, very limited. But yes, reading it over and over, and women who were so accomplished as well, was just, I found that really kind of demoralizing and upsetting. And the other thing that I discovered, which I think maybe I sort of knew intuitively, but it was confronting to read about it, was the group that Evelyn infiltrates. You know, they're quite the extreme end of this far right kind of attitudes, but that a lot of these social attitudes around nationalism and anti-Semitism in particular were fairly widespread amongst the establishment. You know, Britain, as we know, has problematic attitudes, you know, a problematic history when it comes to anti-Semitism, as so many countries in Europe do, but that these ideas that this particular group take and go, you know, kind of extreme with, you know, were quite pervasive at the time too. So it was how, one of the challenges was how to kind of, you know, immerse myself in that way of thinking, and how to kind of calibrate, I suppose, those attitudes as well. Obviously not everyone had those thoughts and those feelings and attitudes as well, but how to scale them against what we now know and what we now think about those particular prejudices and, you know, sort of hatred. So that was fairly kind of confronting too. But yeah, those parallels as well. I mean, the book, we sort of signed off on all the proofs and everything when over there for you guys in the States, when there was, the storming of the Capitol. I mean, it was kind of this, it was crazy that this was happening. I mean,
that's a crazy day. Yeah.
I mean, how can we, that's a whole other conversation, but there were that was a homegrown insurrection, and that this, much small scale in my little book, it just shows that this history is still repeating itself, and this kind of the fermenting of these kind of clashes between ideas and the way that we live and how we are governed just continues. So that was just really extraordinary as well. So it's a story, the events of World War II. I think this is why people are still so interested in it. They keep playing out in a kind of different format across our time, our time span since the war. And that's why when we're reading it, I think we can draw these kind of quite powerful parallels.
So are you working on a new project now? Because you're not doing enough,
Yeah. I've finished the PhD, so I've got to take on something huge now.
Yeah, exactly.
I would like to, I am thinking and starting to plan out another book project. But it's in the very, very early stages. So it is set abroad again for me. It's set in some different locations overseas, which is challenging to my research because obviously we can't travel at the moment. So I'm just sort of thinking about ways I can, using Google Maps a lot, and just thinking about how I can plan for that. So, but yes, I do hope to be writing in properly in again very, very soon.
If it takes place in New York City, just let me know. I can be your, eyes.
Wonderful.
FaceTime you from the street or something,
Any excuse to come back to New York, I'll be absolutely there.
I've never been to Australia. It's like number one on my list. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I would love to.
Well, whenever we reopen our borders, it would be wonderful to have you come over here. It's a beautiful country. It's big though. You need a lot of time. To
I know, which I don't have. Mom's still have time to go to Australia, so
Yeah, I understand.
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
To persevere, really. I mean, so much of writing, for me anyway, is about sitting up, sitting at the desk, sort of turning up for work, I suppose. So much of the work on this book, as it was for my first book, was taking the material that I had in that first draft, which was, very unwieldy, very messy, and just revising and working and for me, obviously, a lot of it was built around the research, feeding that research through, taking things out. But yeah, being persistent and being patient. I think that's the biggest requirement of a writer, because it is challenging at times, and it can be frustrating when things aren't coming together as well. And like I said, this is a book that took me sort of 4 years. I had a baby sort of in between. Thankfully, I'd done the bulk of that writing work before he turned up. But yeah, that kind of patience and perseverance, I think, is the best thing to continue, and to also to be open to sharing your work with others. I've found that having some really great trusted readers to get feedback, really objective feedback, has been really instructive and helpful for me. So I've been really lucky in that respect.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. Thanks for waking up early and doing this podcast. And
my pleasure. I mean, as you can see, I probably would have been up anyway. So,
but you wouldn't have been all dressed and everything. So,
oh, thank you.
Early start of the day.
And thank you so much for having me, Zibby. It's been so lovely to chat.
You too. It's been great. All right.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.